So thinking today about cabinets of curiosities and how prevalent they were in early modern Europe, and especially at courts. And these really are the predecessors of our modern day museums. And as we'll see, they were encyclopedic in scope. They contain natural and man-made objects with paintings and sculptures displayed alongside scientific instruments, preserved plants and animals. And within this framework, tiny creatures such as insects and simple flowers became real protagonists, and genres came out of that, still life painting and so on and so forth. But this intersection and interaction of art and science is relevant to the Ex de Medici show in more ways than one. And in my talk today, I want to refrain from you thinking it's with some sense of nostalgia that I'm talking about these sites of great learning and thinking. It's not nostalgia, but rather to point, I think, to another time, to another way of thinking, and see what we can learn from this. I think that's one of the most powerful things we can do as viewers of art and thinkers and people who are taking from the past important lessons. So the big question is, what do these collections and their systems of display as kind of microcosms of the 17th century world tell us today? When studying cultures of collecting and the related practices of display, what's especially striking is the changing role of art and objects in the shaping of knowledge. And things that shine through when you think them through quite carefully is that there's motivating factors that vary. There's not necessarily one impetus for all of them. Ideas of appropriation, control, memory, power, seduction, and wealth become apparent, but so too does thinking and learning and study. So we want to critically investigate these practices of collecting and display, just as X does in her work. And if you haven't seen the show, please make sure you see it before it leaves, because it teems with moths and guns and skulls and a multitude of different things given very careful, rapt attention. And I think just as in these curiosity cabinets, these things in X's work become vectors for action and thought and critiques of mechanisms of control as related to what we collect and display and why. So I want to start by thinking about where we usually see collections and display today. And yes, I'm thinking mostly about the European tradition, where the roots of a kind of impulse to collect and display can be charted all the way back to antiquity. So a really swift historical survey would reveal various cultural values and how they relate to collection and display. So I'm sure you all have some thoughts on this. Why do we collect? Why do we display? What do we collect? What do we display? And some, I made sort of a little list. I have things here like expressions of wealth and power, presentation of family dynasties. In the past, you'd see a lot of trophies of military conquests, booty, the spoils of war brought home, if thinking of Rome and Greece, things like that. But also articulation of an understanding of one's place in the world. And in these collections I'm about to work through with you today, the idea of kinship, showing something because it's familiar, or the idea of something being exotic and foreign and therefore put on display. But overwhelmingly this sense of longing to understand the past, which is very crucial. So there's all kinds of overriding questions that present themselves. In a collection, what is the attitude toward the past? What we choose to preserve and display says a great deal about a person and a culture. Another question that I think a lot about when it comes to collecting and display is how, last week we talked about Venice, and I was telling you about the course that I teach there. And in Venice, we're thinking a lot about works of art that are in situ, so in the spot for which they were created. So things like altarpieces. If you think about that work, being in the place for which it was created and the kind of, I suppose, community that existed around it and continues to exist around it, that's very different from seeing a work like that, an altarpiece set up in the National Gallery or taken out of its original context. So the idea of a contextual art history is one of the things I think about a lot. So when it comes to our large-scale galleries and museums, the idea of something being taken out of that original context and placed in there during like the collecting mania of the 18th and 19th centuries, that's interesting. The experience of it is completely different, right? So that's something I think about. One of my favorite art historians is Abi Warburg, and I quote this all the time. He says, "We are witnesses of the migration of art." And I think that's a very compelling phrase for thinking through what you're seeing when you go into the British Museum. Things removed and put into a new space. You see art and objects carefully arranged on view instead of being used, and the altarpiece being an obvious example of that. This slide is more about how did museums and galleries come to be the primary sites of display? You know, what is the history of that? The history of museums and galleries is a whole thing in and of itself. And it's often said that museums and public galleries were born during the Enlightenment. And, you know, for better or for worse, these are the primary platforms for collections today. These spaces are erudite machines. They are not value-free. Thank you. And is there a pointer? I love a pointer. Last week I was pointing at stuff. Just rant, anyway. Thanks. Perfect, thank you. Okay. So, and I like to think of a quote from Goethe, who's this 18th century writer. I think is very interesting. He writes that collecting and display allow for, quote, the sense at once of the past and the present. And Goethe spends a lot of time talking about how the sight of old pictures and statues can kind of create a sympathy for the age in which they were created. And I think it's important for us to think through how galleries and museums make a part of the past contemporary. And the works then need to be reinterpreted in the context of our own day. And I think it's important to consider how we need to be very receptive to previous generations. And I always say to my students, keep the history in art history. It can't just be all about contemporary theorizing. We need that sense of the past as well. It's built into and really important to our discipline. When thinking through these erudite machines, these spaces, I always like to think of the 4 C's: creators, collectors, connoisseurs, curators. All are interacting to afford a display. You know, what you see in X's show has been put together in a particular way, and that matters to our understanding of it or our experience of it. And the idea of collection gaining its kind of a sense of itself or a meaning, we need to consider not just the art, but also the kind of envelope in which the art is delivered. Gibbon says a society can be measured by how it treats its dead. Well, I like to extend that to think you can also think about how a society values its past works or not. And, you know, that's central core business for the history of art. One way to think about this is to think of the opposite of a welcoming museum. I think museums are clearly being critical of some aspects of it doesn't mean I think they're crucial and absolutely vital to communities and societies. But thinking about the opposite of a welcoming museum, so the idea of, say, during times of war, burning, looting, pillaging, think of the power that's vested in the destruction of things and how there can be a sense of pain that comes with that. So strong periods of iconoclasm. And I was thinking specifically about the invasion, the American troops who trashed museums in Baghdad during the Iraq War in 2003. That was documented and deeply problematic. And then also locals who were looting various collections. Like, we can and must protect these public collections. I think that's the main takeaway of that. And just to sort of lend credence to the need for these kinds of collections. Now, as I've been saying, public museums and galleries are the primary context in which we experience collections and display today. And I always think of them as a kind of envelope the art is delivered in. And this is how most of us experience art. And they're essential parts of cultural identities at home, but also when we're traveling. You know, if you travel abroad, you usually hit up whatever major museum or site is in that place. So thinking about preservation of a community's cultural memory, what is valued in that community, and what is on display, and the idea that no display is neutral. Ideologies are embedded, whether we think about it or not. So I think this questioning can really begin in the architectural framework of museums, and that's why this slide is here. So before we even go in, what are we experiencing? And I think there's a lot of debate about what is an appropriate architecture for a public gallery or museum. These three sites prepare us for a certain kind of experience, I think. So starting with the temple facade there of the British Museum, it's borrowing the form of a monumental structure of the past. It's, the etymology of the word museum is Greek. It comes from the word mauseon. And this was a term for temples dedicated to the muses of the arts and sciences. So learning and collecting and display were intimately linked in antiquity. So a temple, and now it becomes a kind of temple to art. Thought of as appropriate for a really, really long time. The temple facade, if you go to Art Gallery of New South Wales, the original building's a temple facade. And I could make a huge list for you of cities in the world where the main gallery takes that form. So for a long time, that was thought to be completely appropriate. Then thinking about the Tate Modern, I'm sure many of you have been there, to all of these. I mean, that's just entirely different, isn't it? A repurposed space, a power plant. There's intentionally an attempt to set, this modern and contemporary work aside from, I suppose, more traditional associations. A seemingly mundane building completely transformed, and a very dramatic entrance, when you cross that bridge over to the building, and then there's the famous turbine hall in there, and all of that is made good use of by the curators and the people who run that space. So a very different, envelope for the art than the British Museum. With all those venerable ancient associations, we move to sort of industry and thinking of something completely different. How about the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao? I mean, that's another entirely different experience from the British Museum. But there's a kind of ritual there too. And the architecture itself is becoming the experience, I think, or part of the experience. So we have these possibilities for like a radically differentiated space being explored. The idea perhaps that the museum is a space to be where you get transported elsewhere, by the very building in and of itself. And that kind of approach to, the newness of the architectural form is increasingly embraced by, if you think also of the Louvre and how they planted that glass pyramid in the foreground. So new ways of having an envelope for art. So moving beyond what could be perceived, moving beyond traditional experience, I suppose, stepping out of time, attaining a new, larger perspective, or a kind of flight of fancy. Those are things that come up for me when I contemplate that space. And that is kind of in step with what a lot of contemporary artists see as, the idea of art as an experience, right? The idea of art as spectacle is absolutely something that has been picked up on by any number of contemporary artists. And it's a building that was heavily criticized. I don't want to say it just, what appeared and everyone was happy. There was a lot of criticism of this idea. But again, so I think these three spaces really should get you thinking about how even before we enter GOMA, we have a certain kind of structure ahead of us that's very different from QAG, right? Those are two different envelopes for art right there. So what messages are they delivering? What is the setup for you? What is, I think that's really, really important to contemplate. Now, when we go inside, our experience is also influenced by their settings and also how the works are arranged, presented, and displayed to us. The display confers a kind of meaning. And how to do that is increasingly scrutinized. And the rise of the curator as a person of importance within the 4 C's that I mentioned. I mean, it used to be that artists would curate their own shows, right? They would, there's stories from the Royal Academy in France of artists setting up their own display and arranging things as they wished. So how to display, increasingly scrutinized. And the ways that we're used to now, so rows of paintings, white walls, the whole a white cube kind of aesthetic is what I want to communicate today is a fairly recent phenomenon, okay? It's relatively recent. It influences how we experience the art. A lot of the time we're used to artificial lighting, white walls that isolate the works from other works, and that is very much the kind of modernist approach when the work of art is seen to be self-sufficient. Contrast that with this salon hang on the left, which is less about with Guernica on the right there, it's isolated, it's an object for contemplation in and of itself, autonomous. In the earlier salon hang, which I can tell you was in place, right through the 18th, mid-19th century, etc., we have absolutely a kind of sense of a jigsaw puzzle effect for how the works are put together. And it wasn't even necessarily early on about chronology or sensing the kind of development of an artist. You'll often see shows like that today, but more about an aesthetic experience, more about often subject matter would be placed together, a kind of thematic approach rather than sort of chronology or sense of the development of a particular artist. So this is just this reminder that the things we're used to are fairly recent. With our historical sensibility, we can see just how new some of the approaches that we're very accustomed to absolutely are. And a lot of what I want to talk about today is the separation of art objects from other objects, natural history specimens, for example, and how that too is a fairly recent phenomenon. So just giving some sense to this historical survey and trying to dig deep, thinking about antiquity with the Greeks and Romans, and always having this question in mind: why do we collect? Why do we display? And how does it get enacted in the various envelopes of art that we're finding through history? So why do we collect and how do we display? I think, it's also useful to look to the literature, to look to poetry to get a sense for that. And one of the earliest passages I often tell my students about is in Homer, how we hear of weapons of famous heroes being preserved by their descendants. So brought to Greek temples as offerings. And right there you have that sense of collecting for family lineage, and also the idea of those objects being vested with power, right? Objects which those heroes of the Trojan War had been in contact with were considered to be, imbued with kind of magical powers. We also find in the Greek and Roman texts this sense of unusual things being collected. So substances that had healing powers, rare objects from foreign lands, Those objects had cult purposes and were displayed accordingly. You could attain a real power from some of these works, kind of a ritualistic quality to them. And of course, the idea of wisdom, which I mentioned right at the outset, with that idea of the term museum being mauseon, so linked firmly to wisdom and linked to these temples dedicated to muses of the arts and sciences. And Aristotle is a great source on this. He talks about his biological studies and how he'd collect specimens and put them on display. So basically, I'm just sort of unpacking some early instances that aren't about paintings on walls, basically. We want to sort of understand the complexity of all of this. The idea of lineage, so to foster, and that's where this one comes in, this idea to foster a relationship with the past. And that's sometimes, in early collections linked with a notion of superiority. So thinking of how by the end of the 4th century, earlier sculpture was being collected. So Roman collectors are gathering together Greek statues, especially when Greece became part of the Roman Empire. It was about a triumph over another culture. And if you look at a lot of collections of ancient statuary, you'll notice a Roman copy of a Greek original, Roman copy. And in doing that, it was sort of, a lot of what we know about Greek statuary is thanks to Roman copies, in fact. And so right there, you have another impetus. It's this idea of collecting to preserve a past as culture that is, in a way, vanquished, right? So that's another important element. And Pliny the Elder wrote about this, the vast multitude of Greek statues in Rome. And now that carries through, of course, to the period where we are going to really spend some time today, early modern, so, Renaissance, and particularly Renaissance, Rome in this instance, all of that being revived. So you have Pope Julius II, for example. He's a really important patron during the Renaissance, and he establishes a garden of antiquities. And we know that there were about, and that right there you have the whole notion of revival, of antiquity, Renaissance, rebirth, and that's often seen as a main characteristic thereof. So their study of and consideration and almost archaeology of Rome, they're unearthing the old things again. They're revitalizing these collections that they knew of. And we have really important sources on this from people like Martin Heemskerk, who did all these drawings and sketches of the antiquities. It's then turned into engravings, and that gets dispersed, and people start to understand how collections are working in this period and just how many Greco-Roman statues there were on display in this very interesting form of display. So what I find particularly interesting about these is how the ancient sculptures would be put on display, and you'd have artists like Michelangelo and Donatello putting their newly created works right next to them. Okay, so right there we have a really crucial impetus for display, a kind of allegiance to a past model. And that happens in art history a lot. And for a long time, that was seen as the way to think art history, by putting artists in this kind of trajectory. So we see this kind of model enacted in something like this. And of course, just getting a sense of how it's done here. I mean, again, a very busy display, all these niches full of statuary, a lot of them fragmentary. So if I can get my pointer to work, just famous works that are, without limbs. There's a famous work from antiquity, the Belvedere torso, which is no head, no arms, no legs. And it became a source of inspiration for countless artists in the period. And so that idea of completeness that takes over in the 18th, 19th century is not present in this particular moment. Now here's a sort of something completely different. But again, thinking about this impetus towards and culture of display, and we need to consider I'm skipping swaths of history here because I have 1 hour and I really want to get to these cabinets. But what I want to sort of plant in your minds is, thinking certainly, I don't want to sort of dismiss or leave out the whole of medieval art and the medieval period. And of course, thinking about display in churches is really important, and understanding how crucial things in situ were for that period. But I also want to think about the possibility of a culture of display that is linked in a way to death and funerary elements, because that was quite important for the early Greeks and their mausoleum. The temples for wisdom and learning could also be sites for funerary activities and ceremonies. And you could think of that link of collecting with death. Think of Egyptian funerary monuments. So the pyramids filled with the belongings of a pharaoh, to go to the afterlife with his stuff, and like genuinely, that was the idea. And here I'm showing you, it's a bit of an obscure example, but it's one I find very interesting. It's an ossuary in what today is Czech Republic, the Sedlec ossuary. And it's a small Roman Catholic church, and it contains the skeletons of between 40 to 70,000 people. And many of the bones are sort of artistically arranged and on display, as you can see here. And the reason for this church coming to be has to do with a particular abbot from the monastery who was sent to the Holy Land and grabbed a piece of earth from Golgotha where Christ was crucified, brings it back, and that's basically the impetus for like a whole church and community of believers coming up around it. During various plagues, this became a site well known for good treatment of your remains. So here we have a kind of very interesting approach to display and thinking about Sedlec as a kind of desirable location for, funerary rites of passage. But now, really getting into the heart of our topic. So these are two examples of studioli in Italy. So studioli is plural, studiolo is singular. And these are very important sites as we consider our evolution towards those big galleries and museums that we're so accustomed to that stem from the Enlightenment. Before those, there were the studioli of Italy, which had an intimate connection between display and learning. And these were conceptual and physically demarcated spaces that were very prevalent at 15th and 16th century Italian courts. Studiolo was emblematic of like a learned culture that many rulers aspired to and sought to foster. And especially well-known examples can be found at courts in Urbino, Ferrara, Mantua, Florence. The thing to notice here is that these are reconstructions. No studiolo has remained fully intact from the early modern period, and current reconstructions rarely give the sense of what they looked like in the time when they were created. The main thing to notice is they would have been full of so many things, lots of objects alongside these decorative programs, and in fact, in dialogue with those decorative programs. So in addition to books and works of art and treasures and wonders, both man-made and natural, private and princely collections, they absolutely contained any number of things. I'll show you some examples in a moment. So apart from being a place of learning and contemplation, the studiolo evolved into space to display an owner's most precious possessions, cameos, jewels, artifacts, all of which combined to enact a display that, if you had visiting dignitaries, you'd bring them in, and that was part of their experience of your home and your hospitality. So the point with these two is to say objects were as central to the practices of display as were the decorative programs that you see reconstructed there. Objects and artworks were viewed as an extension of the owner's learning and erudition, and by further extension, that of the court. So the one on the left here, Isabella d'Este, she's one of the most important patrons of the Renaissance. She sponsored Mantegna, Titian, Leonardo da Vinci. She had tons of advisors and agents whose sole job was to sort of collect and gather together and bring back precious things for her. And she amassed an unrivaled collection in her studiolo. She had a grotto. She had all these spots where she could do her study. And then how do we know this, you may ask? Well, there's an inventory of her collection that itemizes more than 7,000 objects. And they would keep inventories and sort of itemize everything so that, and from those inventories, we gain the sense that these weren't just disparate, bunch of stuff like gathered together, like clutter, but rather relationships were imagined between the different things. There was a cohesiveness to how the collection worked. And I say worked on purpose because it was about use and living, breathing things that had lives that mattered to the person who owned the studiolo. So not just on display, but there for thinking and learning and understanding and contemplating one's place in the world. That's why I call it microcosms of the world. Isabella was a keen politician. Something else interesting to note about her, and it's like we really need to use our imagination here. And there's a wonderful website about Isabella d'Este's collection where you can go and sort of see the inventory, get a sense of her as a patron. I highly recommend. It's wonderful because she had lots of interests. She operated a perfume and cosmetics pharmacy. She was interested in musical performance. She advocated for gardening, fashion design. So my point here is we need to also move beyond thinking of these spaces as just for the eyes, because every sense was enacted and every sense, the smell of the perfumes, taste, etc. So every sense had its role here. A haptic connection, touch the objects. We're not encouraged to do that in our current, don't go touching X's. Basically, that sense a lot of the times is, shut off to us, right? But in these early collections, it was a different story. So the studiolo there on the right, Francesco de' Medici, again, similar story to Isabella d'Este. This would have been, so you see here the reconstruction of the painted program, but it would have been full of lots of other items that were actually in correspondence with the decorative program you see there. Now, the cosmology of the period was a lot to do with the four elements. I'm going to say a lot more about that in a minute. But basically, the idea that earth, air, fire, and water, you would have expression of that in your decorative program, and then related objects underneath. So what I said about Isabella's studiolo, that it had a cohesion, we absolutely know that as well for Francesco de' Medici's studiolo. So it's this fascinating sense of, as I say, a microcosm of the world in your study, basically. Very early attempts at a kind of encyclopaedic display where art was functioning, what we call art, so the paintings, the statues, etc., were functioning closely with all these other things. Now, I've got Holbein's ambassadors here, and it's been chopped. Sorry, that's a truncated version, where actually the thing I wanted to show you is not present there. So we've had a late edition here, but those of you who know the painting know that there's this famous anamorphic skull in the foreground. But anyway, one of the main reasons to show it to you as well is getting a sense of this from the English courts, and the display on the table between the two ambassadors is a really important instance of still life, and again, that amassing of things to do with astronomy and astrology and mathematics and learning, and how central that was to activities at the court. So the ambassadors is a very fantastic example of the kinds of trends we're thinking through for learning. This is even better for giving a sense of that. Now, this is a very modest work, quite small, quite diminutive, but it absolutely gives us a sense of what the studiolo, and then in the north of the Alps, as they say, so in Northern Europe, what they called these collections was the Kunstkammer, so Kunstkammer, art room, or Schatzkammer, so room of treasures, and then also this notion of the curiosity cabinet comes in. So these three terms we see in inventories, and they're interrelated, and there's a veritable explosion of this kind of approach to collecting in this period. And those reconstructions I showed you, the Italian examples, this is just giving you a good sense of what those spaces might have looked like. So again, there's all these inventories from different courts where we see a kind of comprehensive and encyclopedic approach to collecting and display. And the terminology, the Kunstkammer, the Wunderkammer, room of wonder, gives you a sense of how important these were to modes of contemplation, to people's experience of the world, basically bringing the world in small into your study, right? Very important sites of learning. So this gives you an indication as to what such a Kunstkammer might look like, albeit on a smaller scale. This 17th century miniature, we see 3 tables full of cabinets and objects, and just getting a sense of the variety of things here. Globes, books, statues, skulls, shells, porcelain, especially prominently displayed, paintings ranging from still lifes to religious scenes, shelves of books covering almost all of the wall surfaces. And in the front of the left table on the ground, this row of cannons, rather ominously pointing towards the center of the room. But then also over here, this chair, just waiting for you to come in and have a seat and think, not just by reading, but by looking and close looking and touching and, various smells that could be enacted in there as well. So a site for the multitude of senses through this gathered array of objects, which to our eye we might go, is there order in this chaos? There is. We know that from the inventories. We know that from how they're laid out, the correspondences being suggested. And as I mentioned, this idea of the 4 elements being an overarching concern and structured along those kinds of lines. There are really important sources, beyond the inventories. There's a particular treatise by a writer called Samuel von Kiekeberg. He tends not to be very well known, but for people in museum studies, they know this text because in 1565, he basically puts together what's referred to as one of the first treatises on collecting and museums. And in that text, he talks about how the recording and analysis and investigation of art and nature was the highest goal of human activity. That material culture, that things embodied knowledge and necessitated that act of collecting and display. And he goes through various categories. And these are interesting and important for what I'm going to tell you next. So I'll just run through them very quickly. Naturalia, so botanical items, wood, fruit, dried plants. Included also naturalia, animals, zoological specimens, minerals, and other natural history specimens. He talks about that as one category. Artificialia, so artificial things, man-made materials, paintings, sculpture, prints, books, textiles, ceramics, jewelry, ornaments, coins, metals, and furniture. Then the next category, exotica, ethnographic materials from distant places And for this, European culture, places such as Asia, Africa, India, Persia, Turkey, Siam, China, and the Americas are all named in these inventories. And then scientifica, so scientific instruments, clocks, globes, various navigational devices, all brought together in one. We don't display stuff like this anymore. We just don't. So, and that's part of the next part of the story after I talk through another example, but we separate out post-Enlightenment all of these different things. But the important thing to take away here is that the Kunstkammer was regarded as a microcosm, as a theater of the world, as a kind of memory theater as well, as a way of initiating and maintaining and deepening understanding. And importantly to my next example, I think it's important to see that, today we also separate out largely art and science, okay? They're thought of as kind of incommensurable realms of experience. But in this period, in this mode of thinking, that dichotomy was not maintained. There were rich relationships between the arts and sciences at these courts, at these microcosms of the world, within these collections. And the manner of collecting and display characteristic of these zones. It wasn't idle pursuit or just curiosity. It was an attempt to organize diverse objects in a way that would reflect something about them, something about their original disposition, their place in a chain of creation, if you will. So it wasn't just about possessing the things. I mean, that element is absolutely there as well. These were also seen as collections that if you owned kind of the microcosm, you could have power over said microcosm. We have examples of that shining through in various documents, that this metaphor was taken so seriously, especially by our next example. Now, this is just to give you a view of Prague in the 16th century. I'm going to be speaking about a particular court now, the court of Rudolf II in Prague, because these ideas around the Kunstkammer absolutely blast through with him. And we've already looked at one of these before. The week Michael Zavros was here, we looked at Giuseppe Arcimboldo's Rudolf II as Vertumnus. What I want to suggest now is, or tell you about now, because it's very carefully researched and we know a lot about the court of Rudolf II that supports this. At that court, astrology, astronomy, botany, medicine, metallurgy, zoology, they were all intimately linked with artistic production because of the size and complexity of the Kunstkammer that was housed at that court. This was one of the most enormous and all-encompassing collections of the period, just vast. And it's not that well known. There's interesting reasons for this. I remember when I was doing my PhD and I started doing some work on this court, a lot of the scholarship up to that point would say things like, Rudolf was a melancholic who just tucked away, or he was so into Kabbalah. He's just unusual person, like into all this mysticism, etc., and strange pursuits. And it was almost as if the personality of this emperor and things like this, paintings like this that just stick out in the period, led to this idea that the court was sort of unusual, maybe an aberration, not really worth taking seriously. There's kind of a lot of mannerist works that come from the period, and for a lot of art historians, they were seen as lesser, all this stuff. That's all, forget that. That what's important is that at this court, we have such easy access to understanding and thinking through these collections, and it's so boldly manifest in the art of the period as well. So not only does Arcimboldo show Rudolf II as this emperor who is, under whose benevolent rule all the seasons are conjoined, and fruits and vegetables from different time periods can coexist because he's that powerful. And he in fact transforms into the god Vertumnus of all seasons. So this is a very intense metaphor, isn't it? Beyond that, we also have, being brought to the court, these incredible composite heads, which are articulations of, in this instance, the 4 elements. But he also does the 4 seasons. There's a famous one where it's like, I call it library man, because it's a composite head made of books. It's quite spectacular. But basically, that idea of the 4 elements, that kind of cosmology, and that percolating through to how the collection was enacted and the ordering that they put in place there is manifest in works like this as well. So that is a way of accounting for them, because so often you'll see these Arcimboldo works, like particularly this one is often used on cookbooks, and it's just there on a cook, oh yeah, nice vegetables. But this painting had a very serious intent behind it. And I mentioned to you when we did the portraiture session that it was about saying there was a poem that accompanied this painting, and the poem said, bow down to Rudolph II and don't laugh at this picture. It's very serious. Like there was actually an admonishment not to have a giggle at this very unusual depiction. So Arcimboldo, aware of that possibility. And we know this beyond Arcimboldo as well. So also coming from the court are these fantastic works that, again, are articulations of a kind of cosmology or understanding of the world at large through a kind of microcosm that could be contained within the collection. And Joris Hofnagel, a Netherlandish artist who comes to the court in Prague, and I should add that in, it wasn't just local artists working for Rudolph. He brought in countless artists from all across Europe to work at his court. And that proliferation of works dealing with cosmology, the decorative arts explodes there as well. All kinds of artists invested in thinking about our place in the world. And while we may look at, okay, we no longer think that way, Earth, we don't, our cosmology has shifted, this is still a very interesting and kind of important moment in which everything is being thought of together, contextually, as a system, as opposed to isolating things out separately. And of course, enabling that important relationship between art and science that we see in an artist like Hofnagel, who is putting together basically these stunning watercolors that are delving into the animal kingdom and trying to think through ordering them as well as depicting them and enabling people to have access to them through the visual. So enabling that study, right? And I mean, the 4 elements, he divides it as follows. So the first section is called Rational Animals and Insects, Fire. It's awesome. The quadrupeds and reptiles, so Earth. Then he's got aquatic animals and shells, so for the water. And then amphibians and flying creatures for air. And basically, through about 300 miniatures, is trying to depict everything that's known to him, every animal that's known to him, and order them according to these elements. So it's completely different from Linnaeus and that approach to taxonomy, right? But this is like an approach to him articulating his understanding of how, these animals and their place in the world. Anyway, so very different from our contemporary understandings, but fascinating in terms of a different ordering system, and one that matters enormously to these early precursors of museums today, museums and galleries, to the Kunstkammer. We see that, so it's not just in the watercolors They also get transformed into prints, and you could spend a lot of time. This is Jakob Hofnagel, so his father, in fact, and Joris's father. And I mean, you can spend a lot of time with these, trying to imagine, and it doesn't matter that we know exactly the intention between all of these relationships that are being depicted, because they do strike us as unusual, right? But you can spend a lot of time working through these visuals and sort of trying to, imagine why the mouse is with the P, why the, etc. So it's like opens us up to a kind of different sense of understanding of the order of things. I also want to share with you some of these, because these sort of paintings of the collections really further our understanding of just how, beyond the court of Rudolph II, which is a very intense and sort of magnificent example of how important a Kunstkammer and curiosity cabinet could be, we have a whole suite of painted works that show collections. So they are helpful to us in terms of understanding those reconstructions of the studioli I showed you earlier. They help us to imagine what these collections actually looked like. And in the Franz Franken, so there's actually a whole genre that emerges of like depicting curiosity cabinets, depicting Kunstkammer that you see sort of manifest here. And again, that idea of shells next to religious works, next to statuary, all these items of learning, a dried seahorse next to a portrait. We look at it and it's slightly jarring, but at the same time, it's exciting. I remember seeing these and these tended not to be published in your standard art history books. They were sort of, it wasn't fitting in with all the giants of, for the period I was studying, the Renaissance and the Baroque periods, and you sort of stumble across them in those days, I was studying pre-internet, okay? So you stumble across them in weird places and spaces and thinking, what is going on here? And just trying to imagine all these different correspondences. And again, pointing to research needing to be done on these worlds that imagine things differently from our own. So I love these paintings. I think they're, absolutely spectacular in terms of highlighting a different way of collecting and display than we tend to enact today. Now, it obviously, I said and this is another terrific example of a sort of a smaller instance in which you really see that variety. And of course, so as much as there was the giant Kunstkammer of the court, there were also sort of more private collections. And, this kind of cabinet you can imagine being in a sort of a merchant's home or something like that. But, of course, the coral, so heavy with significance, often thought of as a symbol of Christ's death and also resurrection because of how coral can rejuvenate. The different prints along with paintings, we tend not to have display like that anymore. And of course, just all these various items, the writing tool to hand, naturalia and artificialia all together and enacting a kind of magnificent sort of display. Now, I said at the beginning this wasn't about nostalgia. We know that things didn't stay like this and that there is a kind of shift that happens around how to display. And this is a good example of how in the later 17th century and 18th centuries, we do start to see things getting separated out. So we're going to start to see our picture galleries being distinguished from sort of ethnography or, again, natural history specimens. And this is a really famous collection by a very famous Danish collector, Olaus Wormius. And he definitely starts this trend of separating things out a bit more. And you can look here and really see there's a lot of naturalia, there's a lot of sculptures, clockwork, but the idea of inclusion of paintings is not happening here. So there's already that distinction happening. And definitely here, so this is later, so early 18th century, and I mean, you know, this is quite a sight, actually, the preserved specimens over here. And we see that shift towards, there is the Natural History Museum, there's the collection for specimens, and what that's going to lead to is the idea of the catalog, right? And, you know, the catalog that separates out and treats individually the elements gathered. So, and then finally, this example, of course, where I started by talking about picture galleries and a different kind of display. So by the 18th, you know, with someone like David Tenier, we absolutely see that shift of art collections from the private domain of aristocracy and wealthy into the public sphere. So we're heading towards the birth of those museums. You know, if you think of the British Museum and later the Uffizi are some of the first public museums, and they're, I think the British Museum, I've got it here in my notes, it opened to the public in 1759, and the Uffizi in 1765. So this shift, I guess it's a way of saying things weren't always as they are now in terms of display and collection, and being cognizant of that is quite important. And by the 18th century, so thinking of the Age of Enlightenment, the interest was more in modeling knowledge in terms of, as I said, separating out those aspects of learning and understanding rather than treating them holistically and as a totality. Collecting was increasingly divided in public spaces, where previously it had been united under the Kunstkammer or the Studiolo. The Enlightenment, of course, is also the era of archaeologists and explorers. There's more exploration happening from these European centers. And of course, what we need to throw in here, and the elephant in the room a little bit, is the politics of empire and empire building. So mercantile activities, exploration, colonization, bringing everything back. We, of course, know what that means for the places from which the stuff is being taken. And that is a really important critique to bear in mind when thinking through those collections. I don't mean to idealize them or anything. I just want to point to a moment where the thinking around how to enact a display was quite different from our contemporary version. Always maintaining the understanding, though, that, of course, the sourcing of those things in a thing like Rudolf's Kunstkammer came with a great cost and consequence for those from whom, say, especially, you know, works being called then ethnography were being taken. So the politics of empire. But basically, instead of the interrelationship with other senses, which the Kunstkammer gave, we move, of course, as well to the eye as to the prioritization of vision that's enacted here. So I mentioned Isabelle d'Este with her perfumes. I mentioned the haptic, the possibility for a tactile experience in a Kunstkammer. That's taken away with this kind of display. So, you know, summing it up a little bit, in the Renaissance, collections articulated a more harmonious representation of the world, for better or worse. Studioli and Kunstkammers were places for symbolically retaining domain over the natural and artificial world. The idea of a theater of a world, the idea, as the title of the talk is, a microcosm of the world. In the Enlightenment, the measurement and order was the rule of the day. So classification became important. Instead of relationships, it was more about taxonomy, okay, and stripping away of a kind of context. It's often referred to as the age of the catalog, and a lot of theoretical tracts start to emerge. So that the idea of the relationships between things being acted in the display shifts in favor of difference and separation of things. And I think that that matters enormously to consideration of the envelope of art that we enter into, as I mentioned from the beginning, and the kind of rise of the art museum in the 20th century, and the shift towards a kind of aesthetic museum, so putting works of art there in terms of beauty and aesthetic contemplation. Of course, that's a whole other lecture, like the rise of the aesthetic experience in the, with Kant and people like Lessing, and understanding, the kind of rise of the autonomy of the work of visual art that coincides with this period. So I hope it's opened up some questions for you, as much as a kind of understanding of how past display could be very, very different. And just to conclude, I want to shift gears a little bit and just mention a couple of the artists who I think are very revelatory in terms of what we're going to do next, which is speak with Ex de Medici about her incredible watercolors and what they have to say about, I suppose, collection and display and ways of thinking through interrelationships between things. And, of course, Ex de Medici's special relationship to scientific illustration and her work in particular on entomology and scientific collaborations. Because to me, and I'll say more about this in the QA, but this is sort of an echo of some of the things I've just worked through about collection display in the early modern period. But I wanted to especially highlight an artist from that period, so Maria Sibylla Merian. And it's wonderful. There's actually a copy of her book on metamorphosis for, she's one of the first to really study the metamorphosis of the transformations of insects from caterpillars to butterflies. And very careful, she's an exceptional woman she's an incredible artist, and doing things that very few women could do in that period. So she absolutely is sort of a heroine of the period, an unconventional figure who sort of paid no heed to conventions of her day, just, did what she needed to do. She, I think, headed alone with her, I think she got divorced fairly early. She headed with her two daughters to South America for this period. That's extraordinary. And studied and thought about the insects of Suriname. And this text was published in 1705. So she's a pioneer of botanical illustration, but she's also a pioneer of women what women not taking no for an answer, and doing things in spite of conventions of the period. And at the UQ Art Friar Library, we have a copy of that text, and it was on display once a while ago, but I've often thought there should be another exhibition of this particular book. So I just see Maria Sibylla, I see X's spirit in some of these early works, and also the Scott sisters who, were early, very important pioneers of botanical illustration in Australia. And to me, these works with their very interesting juxtapositions. So these are 19th century artists. The sisters, and again, this label is slightly off because the first two are by Helena, but the others are by Harriet, I believe. And these clever juxtapositions of sort of seemingly unlikely things, but you don't necessarily show the specimen in a setting like that in Linnaean taxonomy, okay? So their sort of juxtapositions and important pioneering work here in Australia, I also think is seminal, and we could say more about that in the Q&A, but that's it for now.